Hi and welcome to my video. I recently filmed a review of the book 1984 by George Orwell and I had a lot of thoughts about it. And one thing that really struck me as I was reading this book was that even though I was being disturbed by some things, even though some things in it made me feel uncomfortable, at the beginning I was kind of dismissing those thoughts and critiques and opinions with the sort of mantra, oh, it's just a product of its time, it's just, true to its time. And I suddenly became aware of how often I use that phrase and how often I hear other people use that phrase to sort of dismiss the shortcomings of things that were written like in the past. And I thought we should talk about it, because is that legitimate? Is it legitimate to say that, to dismiss the critiques and shortcomings and downfalls of, in this case, classic or modern classic literature, because it's old, because it's from a time where people thought differently? Is that true? Is that okay? And it really struck me, because when I made my review of 1984, I was quite straightforward with my opinion on things, and I didn't let the "it's a product of its time" defense stop me from expressing my thoughts fully. So I was wondering whether is it okay, is it legitimate to, maybe not to critique something written 70, 100 years ago because of the values held at that time, using the defense it's true to its time. So on the one hand, it feels important to acknowledge that there are cultural and value differences now compared to the past. And I do the past because I'm not sure what counts as the past. Like, everything's past, isn't it? But when I say the past, I'm speaking like, 1974, for example, was published in 1984 was published in 1949, but there's also classics that could be from 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So this sort of argument is relevant, it feels, to anything that is considered not modern in its sort of relevancy, I guess. I don't know. But it feels important to acknowledge different attitudes. For example, in the 1800s, the expectations on women and the pressures on women were quite different, mostly, to the expectations on women now. For example, when you read books like Jane Eyre, Sense and Sensibility, Pretty Women, they have very similar sort of story outlines. It feels women finding husbands, that deal. That's obviously very reductive, but that kind of feel to them. And that's kind of true to the time, because opportunities for women were more limited then. So would it be fair to critique these books as not being particularly, I don't know, diverse, or I don't know, feminist, depending what kind of feminist, if you want to use that term, although I don't think that's necessarily the case, because the fact that women wrote these books in the past was a big deal. But could you critique it from a modern perspective, saying that, like, these books are just about women trying to find relationships, kind of thing? Or is it just more relevant to the time? This is a reflection of middle class society in this specific area of that time. Obviously a dramatization. But then I think about books like Jane Eyre, where it's a very beloved book for many people. Really, really value that book. It's a lot of favourites for people, especially on BookTube. I hear so many bigger booktubers talk about Jane Eyre being on one of their all-time sort of favourite classics lists. But when I think about Jane Eyre, which I haven't read, but I do know the synopsis because I have Wide Sargasso Sea, which I do want to read. I think about the fact that the main love interest of the main character, he is a domestic abuser. He is abusive towards his wife. He locks her in an attic. the house, she sets the house on fire, but he's considered, you know, like a good love interest, even though he's abused his own wife. And from a modern perspective, I was like, that's not cool, bro. You know, like, you can't really be doing that. You can't be locking people in 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 your attic for 10 years. It's not really cool. But I feel like that doesn't really, that flaw, that fundamental character flaw, doesn't really get fully acknowledged by at least people I've seen that talk about this book. And I would say, is that true to the time? Did all men in the past think that they should lock up their, you know, mixed heritage wives? I don't think so. Were women super down with that? Probably not. You know, so it feels, that was obviously like one specific example, but that's the sort of wave my brain was on reading 1984 and thinking about it. So what does it mean if we use the product, it's a product of its time defense? To me, it feels like by saying that, there are several sort of assumptions being made. One assumption is that there's kind of a clear divide between the past and us modern people in the present. It feels like there's a very clear, like, it's a product of its time. Like, those, you know, those sexist, those racist, those homophobic people, you know. So when books written in those times have these flaws, it's kind of almost like okayed because, you know, it's just how they were back then. And then us now being super woke, obviously, that doesn't ever happen. And that's one issue I have with the argument. It also assumes that everyone in that era shared the same values, which is not true. For example, H.P. Lovecraft. He's a very, very, dropping my paper, he's a very, very famous horror author. He's one of the founding fathers, basically, of horror. He influenced the genre, heavily influenced the genre. But he was a horrible racist, like a horrible, horrible racist. If you didn't know, his cat, he had a black cat whose name was the N-word, kind of level of racism, and that has to be acknowledged. I value his work, you know, I value what he did for the horror genre as a horror fan, but I'm not going to not acknowledge that he was a horrible racist, and I'm not going to use the excuse that it's a product of its time, that he was just a product of the time. Sure, you know, in the time that he was alive, he died in 1937, by the way, which really isn't that long ago. Yes, there were probably a lot, how to word this? There were more overtly negative attitudes towards people of colour, towards black people. There was a lot of more overt racism. So in that sense, he fits in culturally, kind of like what I said about women and the values and attitudes towards women in the past. He does kind of fit into a specific group of people that believed that. Does that mean that all people of that time were racist and believed the same thing as he did and maybe thought it was okay to have a cat called the N-word? Absolutely not. There are other authors around the same time that weren't as overtly racist, that maybe didn't share his values. So if we say, oh, it's just a product of his time, he's just a product of his time, there is some truth to that because, yeah, it was obviously more acceptable for him to be that way because he was able to name his cat that, you know, publicly, public knowledge. But not everyone shared the same values. So if we say, oh, well, he's just a product of his time, you're just dismissing all the people that didn't agree with him, all the people that maybe were not okay with that. And it's also, again, the dividing line, saying that no one would ever do that now, but racism is still a thing. Have we really progressed so linearly? Have we progressed so perfectly that, you know, obviously, hopefully, no one would ever call a cat that. But people still hold the attitudes and values that people of colour, black people, are inherently, like, inferior. Like animals, hence calling an animal the same name, you know, same racist name. And that's one of the problems as well, that assuming, by using that argument, it's almost a weird sort of insinuation, assumption that we've progress as a culture linearly, when it's definitely not the case. It's much more messy. We're much more on up and down. There are times where there's huge progressions made, like, you know, civil rights, you know, Martin Luther King, all these sort of big pushes for change. And there has been some significant changes. For example, that we don't have segregation, you know, we don't have separate, you know, toilets, cinemas, restaurants, whatever, for people of color, which is amazing. Thank God for that. You know, you could be in a relationship with someone that's a different ethnicity or race or culture to you. That doesn't, but there's also still a lot of systemic racism, sexism, homophobia. There's not very much openness to different genders. There's still all these issues around. So have we progressed linearly? No, it's been a wild ride, and it will continue to be a wild ride because that's how humanity works. We're not perfect. We don't improve like this. We can do this. We make mistakes and things get better and then they get worse. For example, it could be argued that last year, with everything surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd, you know, that was a big dip. That was a big dip. You know, that is another point sort of I have to make in this argument. I feel like I'm not being very fluid or coherent in my thoughts, but it's just hard to get it all out because it's kind of just rattled around my brain. It's also just more like of a feeling I have than something that I can really articulate. And that being said, I don't think we should not read classics and not enjoy them. I think that if you love something, a classic book that maybe has some problematic themes, that has some things you have issues with, then so what? Enjoy it, love it. You can love what you want to love, you can read what you want to read, but it feels wrong to ignore the inherent flaws in it. It feels wrong to not critique it, because you don't have to choose between absolutely loving something and critiquing it and disliking parts of it. You can be multifaceted. You can be both. You can love something whilst also recognizing its flaws. And that's important for us to do that in literature because we want to do better. Because the stuff that's being written now is going to be the classics of the future. So we need to be able to look at something of, wow, that is still considered a classic hundreds of years later. We still love and value this piece of work. It still means a lot to a lot of people. But what are the flaws? What can we do better? Because we want what we write now to be long lasting too. I also read an article talking about this sort of argument, and it really made me think because it argued that people use the product of its time defense to protect their favorite literature or to protect a book, to be like defensive of the author almost. But in actuality, it's increasing its irrelevancy, and I found that really interesting to think of that by trying to defend a book using this argument, you're actually shortening its lifespan, because as time progresses and as hopefully we progress, we're not going to want to look back at the books that do have fundamental flaws. You know, it becomes less relevant rather than actually looking at it as it is, warts and all, and seeing its humanity, I guess, its flaws and its good bits, which increases the longevity because you can use that to help you understand and critique literature now and to help us improve and move forward. But if you ignore those bits, then you're just shoving it aside and you're just making it more irrelevant, because then you got this piece of literature that everyone's like, it's great, but is it great? Maybe it is great, but it has flaws. I don't know if that made any sense, but it made more sense when I read it. Yeah, because when you think about your first encounters, for a lot of people at least, with literature, with reading, especially classics, tends to be in school. Like the first time, for example, reading of Mice and Men or something, a classic piece of literature. For me, the first time reading that was in school. So we want these pieces to be looked at educationally, not just as these marvelous, groundbreaking things. They can still be that, but we need to look at it educationally. And we should educate children to notice these things, to notice that, you know, yes, this book, for example, 1984, because that's what's on my mind, is great. It's great. You know, it has great parts, but it's also horribly flawed. And to recognise that, so these future authors, you know, all these future imaginations, young minds will be able to write something better. So we can continue to learn from it and continue to benefit from it in that sense, because we're learning. But I think I've rambled on enough. I'm not saying you should not read books that you love, classics. You should not love them. You should not say that they're amazing and you love them. But I feel like to look through everything with rose-tinted glasses and to ignore the actual flaws in them feels like you're doing a disservice to the author, to yourself, to the book, and to everyone that has a different opinion. Because I almost wasn't sure whether I should actually express my feelings about 1984 because I didn't want to kind of offend or upset anyone, but I wasn't saying these things to be offensive or upsetting. It was because it's how I felt, and my feelings are relevant, and everyone's feelings are relevant. So if people think, this kind of gets to me in this way, or I want to critique this about this book, it should be heard, because everyone's feelings are relevant, even the bad ones as well as the good ones. That's all I really had to say about this. I tried to film this once before, and it was just a mess. But yeah, it's not very coherent. It's a bit rambly, but it's a feeling that I thought I just wanted to sort of push out there a little bit. But yeah, that's just my opinion at least. Happy reading, and I'll see you around.